Okay, if we could have some quiet, please, we'll get started. Political Speakers Forum Board is proud to present Phil Agee. This is the first of two lectures, or tomorrow will be a workshop in gray matter at 9:30. So we'll meet at 9:30 and then head on over to Tartan Lounge. Phil Agee is an ex-CIA agent. He joined in the 60s and was a secret operations officer in many places in Latin America. And since then he has quit and wrote the book Inside the Company and two other books, as well as editing two books. He's currently working on his fifth book. So without further ado, Phil Agee, and if you're interested, there'll be a workshop and getting CIA off campus. Okay, Phil Agee.
Thank you, Tatsu. I want to say at the beginning that I appreciate very much the invitation to come back here to Carnegie Mellon and to the efforts that Tatsu Ikeda put into making this afternoon program possible, as well as the other members of the Political Speakers Forum Board. I want to start this afternoon with a couple of concepts or hypotheses, if you like, that normally I would leave for the end. But I want to mention them here at the beginning because I want to ask you to keep them in mind as I go through my talk, and I'll come back to these ideas or concepts or hypotheses at the end. First, I would want to assert that the scandalous social, economic, and political realities in which we live in the United States today are in reality no scandal at all. Why? Because these dreadful conditions reflect the U.S. system operating exactly as it should. That is to say, as it was designed to operate from the very beginning. Secondly, I would assert that solutions to the huge problems of which we're all aware today, tragedies that we see all around us every day, will only be found in rewriting the rules of the game in the United States, by rewriting our governing charter, our Constitution, and that this is not unrealistic, it's not off the wall, it is not a crackpot idea. The realities to which I refer, I know I don't have to spend all afternoon going through them, begin for me with racism and male supremacy. They go on to a third of the adult population, illiterate to the degree that they cannot function in a society based on the written word, about the worst educational system in the first world, tens of millions without adequate health care in this country, around 15% of the population living in absolute poverty, and about double that number in dire straits and insecurity. Less than 15% of the labor force organized in trade unions to protect their interests. Cities, towns, infrastructures like highways and bridges, manufacturing plant, all in decline. Violence, gender discrimination, and the drug culture all about. Militarism as the one thing that makes this country feel good about itself. And about half the population declining to vote in national elections. One could go on, but I assure every one of you that I am not on an America-bashing trip. These realities are the simple truth, and I, for one, profoundly disagree with the doomsayers who preached that the United States peaked a few years ago and is now in irremediable long-term decline. The last hypothesis that I want to suggest is this, that the property, relations, and rights established in the Constitution provided for an inherently unfair and therefore unstable society, and that the most fundamental purpose of our government from the very beginning has been to enforce stability. One side of a coin, the other being control, and most importantly, control of the have-nots. The fact that 2% of American families own more than 50% of the net financial assets in this country has relevance, I believe, in this context. Poverty, discrimination, unequal opportunity, and political repression and violence, these have been the flip side of elitist rule, along with corruption. And I would assume that many of you have been following the most recent corruption these last 2 or 3 years, the Iran-Contra scandal, which is continuing under investigation as we're here today. Just recently, 2 of the most senior men in the CIA during the Reagan administration and the beginning of the Bush period have been indicted for criminal activities during that period in connection with the Iran-Contra scandal. You've all read about the BCCI scandal, one of the world's largest banks and most corrupt, used by the CIA to channel billions upon billions of dollars to, for example, the Afghan rebels during the 1980s and early 90s. You've been reading also of another example of corruption and scandal, the October surprise, the supposed deal, in my opinion, a real deal, that was made in 1980 between the Reagan campaign team and the Iranians to hold the hostages in Iran until after the November elections. Both the House and the Senate decided last year to investigate this October surprise, but before Christmas, they both seem to back out. It's still not clear, really, whether they're going to make an adequate investigation. It's the Republicans, by the way, who say that this is a nonsense story, that there was no deal between the Reagan-Bush campaign in 1980 and the Iranians. But it's the Republicans also who are fighting this tooth and nail and have even in the Senate threatened to filibuster, to sabotage the investigation that was going forward in the Senate. You've read also probably of the Inslaw case. Inslaw Software Corporation, which invented developed a program called PROMIS, that's Prosecutors Information Management System, sold to the Justice Department, which then stole it and would not pay. The company went bankrupt, got a $7 or $8 million ruling in the courts, which was then thrown out, and now they are continuing with their litigation. But it happens that the software was given to a Reagan crony who then sold it around the world and made millions and millions of dollars. This was the first man who put the Reagan-Bush campaign, Earl Bryan is his name, a crony from California, the first man who put the Reagan-Bush campaign in 1980 in touch with the Iranians in what developed into the so-called October surprise. Well, keep these ideas in mind as I go through this talk, because the CIA's activities are very closely related, I think, to the domestic system and situation in the United States. The CIA, where I served for 12 years, is, of course, one instrument of government, dedicated from the beginning to achieving and maintaining control and stability. Read the status quo all around the world. I'll mention some examples of CIA operations in a thumbnail historical sketch a little later. But first, to the idea of the CIA as an instrument for a coup d'etat here at home, for the murder of a U.S. president. I was in the CIA in Latin America during the entire period of the Kennedy presidency and the whole Johnson administration, for that matter. And I'd like to take a little poll this afternoon, if you don't mind. How many of you are aware of or have read the wave of attacks on JFK, or some of them, that began even before the filming of the movie began, something that has never before occurred in the history of motion pictures? How many are you aware of this enormous campaign across the United States against the film? Well, that's pretty good, I'd say. How many of you have seen the picture? That's quite a few, too. How many believe that the conspiracy set forth in the film, or some version of it, that Oswald was not the lone killer, that elements of the CIA, the Pentagon, the mafia, Cuban exiles, Secret Service, all had participation? How many of you believe that? How many believe in the original version of the Warren Commission, that Oswald acted alone? Nobody. Nobody. Well, the last question is, how many still feel confused, not sure, wondering where the truth really lies in this matter? Well, I have to confess that I voted for Kennedy in 1960. I was impressed by his liberal campaign rhetoric. I was 25 years old, and I was impressed also by what he would call vigor. He was in tremendous contrast with Eisenhower, who seemed so old and could hardly read a speech. It was funny, this contrast that impressed me so much between Kennedy and Eisenhower because, of course, Kennedy wasn't running against Eisenhower, he was running against Nixon. But I suppose I could be forgiven because I had entered the CIA at age 22. In fact, I was 21 when they came to recruit me at the University of Notre Dame. And I went in the following year at 22, went through military service and the CIA's year-long training program. And then at 25, just about 3 weeks after Kennedy was elected, I was down in South America at my first assignment as a secret operations officer. I went down to the U.S. Embassy undercover as a U.S. diplomat, a political officer, to run and recruit spies. Going into the CIA in the 1950s like that, this is about 1957 that I go in, wouldn't be anything really unusual those days, especially for a person of my background, because as a child growing up, I had had a privileged background. My father had been a successful businessman. My sister and I went to private schools. We lived in a country club-like atmosphere, and we had all the privileges that you can imagine. We didn't lack for anything. And then I went off to university, had a Catholic education, and I really did believe that the United States was a force for justice, force for the right in the world. I mean by that righteousness. And the fact is I had left the university with an honors degree, but with no political education. That was the way it was in the 1950s. Well, after I got down to Latin America, of course, things changed over the years, as they always do. And I began to get a political education down there. What did I see? Well, I simply saw the realities around me every day, the realities of enormous social and economic injustice, wherein a very few, relatively speaking, families had, through generation after generation, possessed the wealth and the land and controlled the commerce. They had the vast proportion of income, and the vast majority of the people were marginalized. They had no hope at all of improving their lives, practically. And this system was something I was seeing around me all day long. I began to realize that everything that I and my colleagues were doing, the whole U.S. government program, in fact, was undertaken with one goal in mind, and that was, again, stability and control. There were plenty of political forces then in Latin America which were seeking radical change, revolutionary change, in fact, and they were our enemy. Little by little, as I went along and I saw that everything I was doing was serving the interests of this very small majority, very small minority, what they call the oligarchies down there, I began to turn against this support. Excuse me. I began to turn against these people because of the corruption and the greed. And I also was beginning to realize more and more to leave that work, forget about it, and start a new life. And I did. I went back to university. My last post of assignment was in Mexico City. I went down there undercover as the United States Olympic attaché. That was the representative for the United States government in the Olympic Games of 1968. And I used that Olympic milieu, the organizing milieu, for a year and a half leading up to the Games for the CIA. Well, after I had gone back to university at the National University of Mexico, studying Latin America, or in Latin American studies, my ideas began to radicalize somewhat as I saw what had happened during the conquest and the colonial period in Latin America, studying the history and the culture and so forth. And I began to think, at one point along the way, what until then had been unthinkable: a book on what I and my colleagues had been doing in Latin America in the 1960s. I thought that a book describing the operations, describing how we were contributing to such enormous injustice, how we were involved in the political repression going on at that time. I naively thought at that time, if I described all these different types of activities, that it would cause such an outrage that people here would demand that these activities stop. That was one purpose in writing a book. The second was solidarity, to put across the methodology with lots of examples so that people down in Latin America and in the rest of the world who might read the book could defend themselves and their organizations better. That was the purpose in writing a book, and I had to decide between my studies and writing the book because I'd started doing some research in Mexico City, and I found that there weren't enough materials. I could not get the information I needed to reconstruct the events that had occurred in order to show the CIA participation. And so I was going to have to leave and go somewhere to write that book, and I decided to go to Europe. I left the studies aside, opted for the book, and spent 5 years working on that book from 1970 until 1974. The book was finally published in early 1975. The CIA learned that I was writing this book early on, and they tried everything they could practically to stop it. I was in Paris for a year, and I was only there, I just begun, a couple of weeks, I suppose, when I began seeing these people following me around in the streets, teams of surveillance. And I wasn't paranoid about that. I had trained and run these teams in Latin America, and I knew what I was seeing. And so I went off and lived underground in a secret place and continued working on the book, was befriended by a couple of young Americans, a young man who called himself an underground journalist and a young woman who supposedly was an heiress, and they gave me money when I had no money even for food. I was destitute in Paris, and if it hadn't been for the support that they gave me as friends, I would not have been able to continue with the book. Well, at one point I had to have a typewriter, and they gave me a used typewriter. And quite by chance, it's too long a story to go into here, the whole story is in my autobiography here called On the Run on the table. That typewriter, which was in a wooden case, had a secret concealed radio transmitter in it, which I discovered quite by chance. And it gave off a directional signal which allowed the monitors to find the secret place I was living in Paris. And it so happened that one Saturday afternoon, I caught the monitors the moment they caught me. Well, I've kept that typewriter. It's a museum piece, and all through these years. But I finally did get that book written, despite the fact that the CIA apparently had an assassination plot underway against me during those early 70s when I was working on the book in Paris and then in London. I didn't know this until last year. 10 years ago, I did receive documents under the Freedom of Information Act which showed that the CIA during those years had committed crimes or illegal acts against me. But the federal judge in Washington, Gerhard Gesell, the same judge who was on the Olive North case, he's had all of my cases, he ruled in favor of the CIA, and they have never had to give me the details of what those crimes were that they undertook against me. It was clearly conspiracy. And it was only last year that a friend of mine, with whom I had gone through the CIA's training program in the 1950s, we met, and he told me that in the early 70s, he's long since out of the CIA and writing his own book right now, he told me that he was told in the early 70s that they were considering making me disappear, which was a polite way of saying, I guess, assassination. In any case, they obviously weren't able to carry that out. But the book did come out and eventually was into 28 languages and is still circulating all around the world today. And the U.S. edition is still circulating now more than 15 years later, which is on the table. It's called Inside the Company's CIA Diary. Well, not only did they try to stop that book, and I'm going to get through this personal stuff as quickly as I can. Not only did they try to stop that first book, but they also undertook a defamation campaign, which puts me right in the, in league with Oliver Stone and Jim Garrison for all these government-sponsored attacks. The first attack was a front-page headline story in the New York Times 6 months before my book was even published. That's what the Attack on the Stone film, of course, reminded me of. They wanted to get in the first blow and discredit before the book even was out. And it was a story in which an unidentified source, of course, in the national security community had said that I was in Latin America in 1972, drunk, despondent, telling everything I knew to the KGB. Well, I had never seen the KGB, and I wasn't even in Latin America in 1972. But that story was published all around the world. It was only the beginning, though, because a lot of others followed, and they followed all through the years. One of the ones I like best is from George Will. You all know George Will, I'm sure, don't you? You know who he is. You see him on television. Well, in one of his columns, he called me something I love. He called me a soiled bit of flotsam from the 60s. And I thought that was wonderful because not only was it a nice turn of phrase, but he took a whole decade off my age because, in fact, I'm a product of the 50s. Well, in 1976, a year and a half after my first book was published, George Bush, who was then the director of the CIA, got together with Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State, and with President Ford, and they sent Kissinger over to London to take up my case with the British Prime Minister because I had finished my book and I was living in Cambridge. And as a result of this intervention, a policeman came around to my door one morning with a deportation notice from the Home Secretary. This began a series of deportations. It was always on public order, that I was a threat to the public order. I fought the deportation in Britain legally and politically, but in the end I had to go 7 or 8 months after it all started. I was then arrested and deported from France, arrested and deported from West Germany, arrested and deported from Italy, deported from Holland, and refused entry to Norway. This was going on for 2 years. And of course, it was the magic hand of the United States government working behind the scenes, because I wasn't the first threat to public order in any of these countries. I didn't even carry a Swiss Army knife. But during those 2 years, I didn't know where I was going to be able to live. My sons went to, I believe, 5 different schools in 5 different countries during those 2 years, and they were teenagers at the time. Well, even when I came back here in 1987 for the first time in 17 years, because I'd stayed away all those years on the advice of a lot of lawyers and of friends whose political advice I respect. But in 1987, when this book was being published, On the Run, which is the autobiography, and it has all those adventure stories and deportations and stuff in it, it was being published, and I sought advice again. Everyone said, again, don't come back, Phil. There's probably a secret indictment. If there isn't, they'll get one. You'll have to go through a very long and costly trial and possibly even do a prison term, a prison sentence. My wife and I discussed it, and we decided in the end that we would take that risk. So we went to Canada, and we came across at Niagara Falls. I started the promotion of the book on television, and they did not touch me. So it was a risk worth taking, because that decision changed my life. Since then, I've been coming back regularly and spoken at hundreds of meetings, just like this one this afternoon. Bush hasn't stopped. When I came back in '87, I wasn't back 2 weeks when he was giving a speech to the National Association of Broadcasters convention in Washington. And during the Q&A, someone asked him, Mr. President, or Mr. Vice President then he was, what do you think of Philip Agee coming back here for the publication of his latest book? And he said, I think that's disgusting and despicable. I have nothing but disdain for that man for what he's done. Well, just about 4 months ago in October, he said the same thing. There was a banquet or a reunion banquet of the veterans of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which was the predecessor organization to the CIA during World War II. 800 people, black tie, Washington Hilton Hotel. But not just these old people, there was the New Boy Network as well. Robert Gates, the new CIA chief, was there. Sophia Casey, the widow of the former director, was there. Former directors like Helms, Colby, and others were there. And in his speech, he gives the principal speech, of course, Bush singles me out by name as a reckless ideologue. He says, I don't care how long I live, I will never forgive Philip Agee for what he's done to the CIA and blah, blah, blah. I thought to myself when my friend called me, it was in the Washington Post the next day, and I was in California, and they called me by telephone and told me what he had said. And I thought to myself, well, at least I'm doing something right to get that type of compliment. But I wondered to myself also, why this gratuitous publicity? Why confirm the effectiveness of someone you consider to be your enemy? Well, I think part of the answer is because we are here today, right now, all of us, and bringing out certain truths that are considered to be subversive. And to be sure, this CIA off-campus movement, about which I'm going to do this workshop tomorrow morning, has had some effect. I've been conducting workshops at every place I go. Not I mean, but organizers from the Chicago-based CIA off-campus National Clearinghouse, and I'll say a little bit more about them later. Normally, the organizers come along with me to these meetings, and I assist at the workshop, but the organizers actually conduct it. Tomorrow, there is no one else here but me, and I will conduct it. But I think that's one of the reasons, because these CIA off-campus activities are having their effect. But I'm also writing another book, for example, an introduction to the CIA and the national security state for students and others who are not familiar with this area. And I don't think they like what they're seeing in that book. I have to submit it, chapter by chapter for CIA censorship, because I'm under a court order to do so. But I think the attempts to discredit right now are for the same reasons why they tried to discredit my very first book some 20 years ago. And the answer is in the CIA's own statement from years ago on the importance of books. This comes from what was a secret propaganda manual, and it was made public by the Senate during their investigations of the CIA in the 1970s. Here is the quote from the CIA on the importance of books. Books differ from other propaganda media primarily because one single book can significantly change the reader's attitude and action to an extent unmatched by the impact of any other single medium. Change, of course, that's what they fear from books. And they're right, of course, that books do have an enormous impact on the reader. And that's why I bring this mini book fair with me to all of my meetings. When I started these lecturing in universities, I early on began to think that a lecture was not enough. I mean, you make the effort to come, but it's not enough to come and listen to a lecture and go away and then just forget it. And there is no way a person can gain a hold or an appreciation of the national security state, the role that the CIA has in it, without doing some reading. And especially the role of the media in terms of mind control in the United States. And down on the table here, there are marvelous books, and I want to mention right now that if people have to leave before I'm finished talking here, and you want to take a look at these books, or buy some books, don't worry about coming up to the table while I'm still talking. Tatsu here has got the change to make money, and you can take a look and be at the book table while I'm still speaking, because I think it is very, very important to read into this area and not simply be satisfied with a talk by someone from me for an hour or so. But on the table there are some terrific publications, some of which I'll mention as I go along. But the Chomsky books on media, for example, are some of the best. There is also the Marty Lee and Norman Solomon book called Unreliable Sources. That's about a year old, that book, or a year and a half, and it is one of the best recent books on how the media distorts what is the news and how they serve government purposes for control and stability through disinformation. Well, these publications, generally speaking, show how the U.S. mainstream media serve the government exactly the way Edward Bernays, the godfather of public relations, prescribed many years ago. I'm sure some of you already know this classic statement. In his 1927 work entitled Propaganda, Bernays wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. It is the intelligent minority which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. This is a man who is considered to be the father of public relations in the United States. Again, the question that he raises, how to achieve control and stability through government and the information media in a fundamentally unfair and therefore unstable society. The government's first task in this sense is to serve the haves, the minority, to keep the lid on and to guarantee preservation of private wealth for the few. Private wealth passes, as we all know, from generation to generation in the same families, normally speaking, protected, though, by administrations and Congresses and courts, which are peopled by the agents of wealth who come and go in a constant turnover. Which is not to say that all wealth is bad. There are numbers of people with great wealth in this country who support very worthy causes, including, for many years, things that I've been active in. But they, unfortunately, are relatively few. I think the same reasons for the media attacks against me, for the deportations, and all the rest, the same reasons are behind the attacks on Stone and JFK. The film violates Bernays' law, which I just read. It defies manipulation by the minority, that is, the cover-up by the Warren Commission back in the 1960s. That's why so many mainstream analysts, journalists, and political figures have denounced the film. The one I like best, I think, was Senator Moynihan's op-ed piece in the New York Times. I don't know if any of you saw that. But Moynihan wrote that the worst thing about JFK is that people under 30 or people under 40 are going to believe that Kennedy was killed by people in his own government. Well, in other words, the film is subversive. It's seditious. It foments doubts about the legitimacy of the political system. It shakes blind loyalty and the conformity, which is the real PC affliction, not multiculturalism. It undermines the conformity to which every one of us is subjected to at every level of our educations. If JFK does this, at least, if it creates doubt as to the legitimacy of the political system, then I say wonderful. Bravo, Oliver Stone. By the way, Stone was in Hamburg, where I live, just about 10 days ago, for the German premiere of JFK. And he told me that the attacks on this film from going on nearly a year ago don't bother him in the least. He rattled off a whole list of high-level people in the Kennedy administration who are confirming to him and in public that Kennedy indeed intended to withdraw from Vietnam. And it's no bad thing either that the film has jump-started the move to make public those 850 boxes or more of classified documents which are a holdover from the investigation of the Kennedy and King assassinations in the late 1970s. And I asked also how the film is doing at the box office, and I'll share that with you. In the first month of the film, it earned $50 million against a budget of $40 million, and they had stayed under the budget. And I think something like 650,000 people had gone to see the film. Well, that means a lot of people are seeing it, and a lot of people are getting the message. No wonder the manipulators in the minority are upset. Well, I want to discuss a little bit the likely roles of the CIA in the 1990s under Robert Gates, if he doesn't go to prison for Iran-Contra offenses. But first, a thumbnail sketch of the historical CIA in order to project the agency's role in what some people call, erroneously I believe, the post-Cold War era. A little about the historical period when the CIA was established. We don't learn enough, I don't think, in the schools about that period. I'm talking about the period from 1945 to 1950. This is very relevant today because it was a transition period. It was the aftermath of World War II. And we are going through a period very similar to this right now. You know, the debate is going on every day. I just saw commentary on this an hour ago on CNN at the hotel about what to do about the budget. It's this state governors convention where Bush was today. And the debate is going on what to do about the military budget, how to reduce the military expenses, where to cut, peace dividend, and all the rest. So we are going through a period right now very similar to what the country went through in the late 1940s. What was the situation? Well, you all know about the Depression. It was only World War II that brought the United States out of the Great Depression of the 1930s. And even before the war was won, the big question in Washington, the big worry, was how to prevent a return to the conditions of the Depression of the 1930s once the war was over. By the time the war was over, the United States had achieved double the production of the best pre-war year. I'm talking about industrial production, twice as high as it had been in the best pre-war year. And this was achieved with 10 million men and women under arms. Well, those people were going to be demobilized. They would be looking for jobs. And as a matter of fact, what the worry, in fact, came true. During the first 4 years after the end of World War II, the economy in the United States contracted by 20%, and unemployment went from almost nothing at the end of the war, 600,000, to 4.7 million in 1950. The question then, at that time, 49 and 50, was what to do about the economy, because it was sinking just like the economy is sinking today. Well, nobody has found the solution today to what to do about the economy. Many people are talking about public investment, education, infrastructure, and so forth, but the debate is continuing. There was, of course, a debate going on then, 1948, 49, and 50. And the decision taken at that time, the conscious decision was taken that remilitarization, rearming would be the solution to the economic crisis in the United States. We must be aware of this now so that we can combat the efforts on the part of Bush to keep that military budget up there. He's only talking about reducing it, you know, by $50 billion over a 5-year period, when the budget itself is running over $300 billion when everything is added in. Well, the problem at that time, around 1950, 49-50, was that the United States was not exporting enough to sustain the economy. What we produced in the country could not be consumed internally, and the problem was export markets. The major markets for the United States were in Europe, and there existed at that time what was known as the dollar gap. The European countries, as a result of the war, did not have sufficient dollars to pay for exports in the quantity that was required to sustain the U.S. economy. And so the Marshall Plan was developed as a way of getting dollars over to Europe for European reconstruction. But that had not solved the problem. By the end of the Marshall Plan in 1949, the dollar gap had persisted. And so the rearmament plan, which was adopted in early 1950, was to send billions of dollars over to Europe in what they called defense support grants. They were not loans, they were grants. And these billions of dollars for rearming Western Europe would then generate imports from the United States to sustain the U.S. economy. The plan was drawn up, a top-secret document, for 25 years. It was called NSC 68, written by Paul Nitze, who was one of Reagan's principal arms negotiators, or disarmament negotiators. Nitze wrote this document in which he outlined all the alternatives and recommended militarism. That is, that the United States would finance the rearming of Western Europe and of the United States. Well, Truman tried to get this money from Congress in early 1950. He could not get the money. There was public opposition to rearming and to the concept of militarism. And it wasn't until the Korean War came along, which started in late June of 1950, that things began to look more favorable for this policy of militarism. The war began in late June when there were incursions from the north and the South Korean military retreated and kept retreating to the south. The North Koreans continued, and this was called an invasion. Well, you know, the first report to Washington from General MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo was that the South had invaded the North. In actual fact, what had been happening ever since partition in 1945 is that there were incursions from the South, incursions from the North. In this case, the incursion from the North to the South was not met with resistance from the South Korean forces. They just retreated, and the North followed them. This is what started the Korean War. And the United States immediately, just like in the case of Iraq and Kuwait, went to the United Nations, got a resolution that the United Nations would form a command, and the United States, of course, ran the whole affair. Several countries like Australia and the Philippines and others, they did send some troops, and Turkey. But in actual fact, that whole war was a U.S. war. Well, what happens is this. By September of 1950, the United States forces have pushed the North Koreans all the way back to the 38th parallel, which was the boundary set by the United States and the Soviet Union for partitioning Korea in 1945. The UN resolution under which the United States was acting called simply for the expulsion of the North Koreans from what was considered South Korea, just like the resolutions did not call for the destruction of Iraq, but for the removal of the Iraqis from Kuwait. Well, Truman ignored the UN resolution and continued on into the north, driving to the north to the Yalu River, which was North Korea's border with China. And the Chinese threatened, as the U.S. got closer, that if they didn't stop, the Chinese were coming into the war. MacArthur did not stop. The Chinese did come into the war, and by late November, the U.S. troops were in fast retreat through ice and snow before these advancing hordes of Chinese communist troops. This was in all the newspapers, on radio, on what television there was at that time. And so in the first week of December, Truman goes on national radio. He declares a state of national emergency, and he goes into an emotional discussion of the Korean War and the Chinese participation in it. He says, our lives, our country, our homes, all that is dear to us is in great danger. And this danger has been caused by the Soviet Union. He was referring, of course, to the Korean War, trying to make it look as if the Soviets were behind the Korean War, when in fact they were not behind the North Korean incursion into the South. They were not behind that at all. That was a purely Korean thing. But he was thinking about U.S. rearmament of Western Europe, and he had to raise the specter of the Soviet Union as a threat to Western Europe. Well, Truman eventually got his money from Congress, and the military budget in the United States more than tripled between 1950 and 1952. In 1950, it was $13 billion. In 1952, it had gone up to $44 billion. And during that same period, the size of the U.S. military doubled to 3.6 million. That was the beginning of the permanent military economy in the United States. It was the beginning of the militarism that we have lived all through these last 42 years. And it was also, of course, the beginning of the arms race. During those early years, John Foster Dulles, who was Eisenhower's Secretary of State, in an interview, he said, yes, I know that we all realize that our military plans are going to create an arms race with the Soviet Union. This is a quote from around 1952-53. But we are richer than the Soviet Union, and they will go broke before we do. Some people think that he was right. Some people think that we're just as broke right now as they are. In any case, as these things were happening in this transitional period, the CIA is established. The charter is the National Security Act of 1947, which set up the CIA as the National Civilian Intelligence Service. It is the first time that the United States in its history had had a National Civilian Intelligence Service in peacetime. The same law established the National Security Council as the highest policy-making body in matters of national security and foreign affairs. By law, the members of the National Security Council are the President, he is the chair, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and then there are other ad hoc members, always have been through the years, like the Secretary of Justice or Attorney General or the Secretary of the Treasury sometimes. It depends on who the President wants on it, or the Director of the CIA, for example. But the CIA was established by that law as an instrument of the President of the United States and the National Security Council. And if any of you have notions out there that through the years the CIA has had its own policy, that it has acted any way it wanted to, forget it. The CIA, through the years, in everything of importance that it's done, it has done on orders from the President himself. Well, the CIA, of course, set up offices around the world and started to do what any intelligence service should do: collect information, both from overt sources like speeches, like radio broadcasts, like magazines, like technical journals, like learned journals, all kinds of publications. These are overt sources. But there was also the spy business, the spy side to it, and that was espionage. And so from the beginning, the CIA was collecting information around the world, sending it back to Washington, to headquarters, where it was processed, and then presented to the President and other members of the National Security Council so that they could make informed decisions. This is known in the business as foreign intelligence, or FI for short, the collection and analysis and processing of information. Of course, we know now, and have known for about a year and a half, and this came out in the Gates hearing, that the CIA all through the years had grossly overestimated the threat from the Soviet Union, principally by overestimating the percentage of GNP which the Soviets were putting into military investments. It was so high, in fact, that the United States, the United States wasted billions upon billions of dollars during these 40-odd years of the Cold War, principally because the CIA had so grossly overestimated the threat from the Soviet Union. And of course, at the very end, the CIA didn't even anticipate or understand what was happening during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the disintegration of that country. That came out also very clearly in the Gates confirmation hearings. Well, besides the FI function, the Foreign Intelligence Collection function, there was another function from the very beginning. At the very first meeting of the National Security Council, with President Truman in the chair, the decision was taken to set aside $10 million for the CIA to intervene secretly in the upcoming Italian elections. They were about 6 months away. They would be held in April 1948. This meeting was in October. This meeting of the National Security Council was in October of 1947, 1 month after Truman had signed the bill into law in September of 47. These $10 million would be passed out by the CIA secretly through front organizations in Italy, through Italian-American organizations in this country, and through the Vatican. And during those 6 months, the money, of course, went to the Christian Democratic Party. Why intervene secretly? To try to buy the elections in Italy? They were the first national elections in that country since the collapse of fascism in 1944. Well, the reason was fear. The left in Italy, the socialists, communists, and others, had formed a coalition called the Popular Bloc. And these political forces had been the backbone of the resistance to more than 20 years of fascism in Italy. And they had come out of the war period, out of the fascist period, with great prestige. And the fear was that they would win the elections honestly. And so the United States decided to intervene with $10 million to buy those elections for the Christian Democrats, the right wing, the conservatives, which is also a political party where many of the people who had been leaders in the fascist movement had found a new political home after World War II. Well, in the end, the Christian Democrats won the elections handily in April 1948. But that wasn't the end of it. During the next 25 years, the CIA passed out more than $100 million secretly to the Christian Democratic Party in Italy, right up to the mid-'70s. In 1976, President Ford approved a CIA payment or subsidy to the Christian Democrats for the elections that year in Italy. I think it was going to be $8 million or something like that. And this was long, long after Italy had recovered from the destruction of the war. They had become one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Well, why? again, control and stability. The U.S. assessment of Italy was that they had to prevent what in that country was known as the historic compromise, a coalition government between communists and Christian Democrats. And the United States did not want that to happen. So they made sure the money kept going to the faction within the Christian Democratic Party that was opposed to this so-called opening to the left in that country. Well, I mention it because this type of operation of election intervention went all around the world. There are hundreds and hundreds of cases in which the CIA intervened secretly in elections to try to buy the elections, influence the elections. I was doing this myself in Latin America. We had presidents of our countries on our payroll. We had vice presidents. We had ministers. We had politicians of all sorts. We even formed our own political parties sometimes. I remember a colleague of mine in Ecuador at one point, through some young Ecuadorian political leaders, he formed a new political party, and he wanted to make it a reformist, centrist party, but to have as broad appeal as possible. So he gave it a rather strange but interesting name. He called it the Popular Revolutionary Liberal Party. Well, these election interventions became known as covert action operations. And election intervention is one example of covert intervention. Covert action are the ways in which the CIA uses money to intervene secretly to prop up friendly political forces and to penetrate, weaken, and destroy those that are considered the enemy. How do they do this? Well, they do it through the penetration and the manipulation of the institutions of power in other countries. What are these? The obvious ones: governments, political parties, military and security services, trade unions, women's organizations, organized religion, cultural and professional societies, youth and student organizations, very important, and of course, most important of all, the public information media. When I was in the CIA, we had operations going in all of these different fields. Media, for example. That's where the CIA will pay a journalist to take and publish the CIA's material as if it were the journalist's own. And the CIA founded and financed magazines, newspapers, academic journals, published books, as I mentioned, I think, before. You remember the quote from the propaganda manual on books. Well, the CIA published more than 1,000 books. They probably published several thousand books by now, secretly, without the hand of the CIA showing that they were financing and publishing the book. They gave a professor at Harvard University, for example, $100,000 or $110,000, I think, to do a book on the Middle East. And it was all a secret contract, and the Harvard professor gave the CIA censorship privilege over the book. In fact, part of the contract was that the CIA had to approve the book that the Harvard professor wrote. Well, another type of covert action, other than what I mentioned, trade unions, political parties, and so forth, another type is known as paramilitary operations. These are the ways in which the CIA recruits, organizes, trains, and then dispatches irregular military forces, guerrillas, for example. These started at the very beginning, as did all these other operations. The Contras, for example, waging terrorism against Nicaragua during the 1980s are only a more recent example of this type of activity that started at the very beginning. The earliest activities were against the Soviet Union and the rest of Eastern Europe. At that time, late 1940s, there were tens of thousands of refugees in the West, and most of them, they were known as displaced persons, most of them were in camps in what became West Germany, in the Allied occupation zones. And the CIA had access to these people. They screened them, they recruited them, then they trained them on bases, and they dispatched them back to carry out guerrilla warfare and sabotage and assassinations and all kinds of mayhem in their countries of origin. Every single country of Eastern Europe was the target during a 10-year period from about 1947-48 to the late 50s of these types of operations. They destroyed railroads. They did everything they could to slow down the recovery in Eastern Europe from the effects of World War II. They wanted to make as large a contrast as possible between the Eastern European countries' recovery and the U.S.-financed Western European countries' recoveries. These then continued and spread all around the world. The books on the CIA that you want to read, you'll find many, many examples. The Contras being a recent example, as I mentioned. The U.S. support to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, another example of the 1980s. One other type of activity, there are three rubrics generally of CIA operations in the theory, one being, as I mentioned, FI, foreign intelligence. These others I just mentioned, covert action, or CA for short. The third category is counterintelligence, or CI for short. And of counterintelligence operations generally, the most important are liaison operations. Liaison operations are all those activities that the CIA undertakes with the intelligence and security services of other countries. These two started at the very beginning. The British intelligence services were the most important at the very beginning. But then the CIA started to form subsidiary intelligence services in different countries. Greece is a good example. For example, in Greece, in the late 1940s, 47 to 49, there's a civil war, and it's right-left. The United States intervenes on the side of the extreme right in Greece. This side wins. And in the aftermath, the CIA establishes an internal security service known as the KYP, or KEEP for short. KYP being the Greek letters for CIA. They gave it the same name. This service became the instrument for keeping the right-wing conservatives in power in Greece for 20 years through intimidation and all sorts of manipulation. In 1967, when there was a danger that the political scene in Greece would change through coming elections, that a liberal would be elected, the CIA and this KYP organization, this security service, organized a military coup. And that ushered in 7 years of neo-fascist government in Greece, what was known as the Colonel's regime from 1967 to 1974. The first president of the military junta in Greece, as a result of this CIA-engineered coup in that country, was the man who until that moment had been the chief liaison officer between the KYP and the CIA office in Athens. That military regime in Greece institutionalized torture and forced thousands upon thousands of Greeks into political exile during their regime. There are many other examples. Iran is one. And Iran is a little more complicated because there was also a coup against a democratically elected civilian government. 1951, Iran nationalizes the Anglo-Iranian Petroleum Company. The British had a monopoly on Iranian's petroleum production. It was one of the largest producers in the world. The monopoly had originated around 1900. And in the late 1940s, there was a lot of agitation to get more out of it for Iran. And so they wanted to change the conditions of the monopoly. At that time, Iran was having to pay the world price to the British for their own petroleum, among other outrages. But the British refused to renegotiate the concession, and in 1951, Iran, under a democratically elected civilian government, nationalized the company. The British come to the United States and to the CIA in particular and ask to organize a coup against that government. As soon as Eisenhower comes in 1953, he gives the okay for the coup to go ahead, and the grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, a CIA officer whose name was Kermit, that's right, Kermit Roosevelt. He, in about a 19-day period in August, organizes this coup which overthrows the government. Well, in the aftermath, the CIA establishes an internal security service, as they had in Greece, and that was known as the SAVAK. They also had support from the Israelis in the training of SAVAK. This was the instrument which kept the Shah in power for 25 years in Iran. They institutionalized torture also. The SAVAK became famous around the world for its assassination of the Shah's political opponents. And they were during that entire period supported and trained by the CIA. I recall television footage from Dutch television in 1979, just on in the aftermath of the fall of the Shah. And some Iranians had found an underground torture center in Tehran, and the Dutch television was able to go in this, and it was on the air. It showed pieces of bodies, like hands and feet that had been severed from torture victims. But most horrible of all was these beds, these steel beds. They had about 4 different levels. They were like steel mesh on steel frames. And they would build these coal fires underneath on the ground, underneath the bed. And the person to be interrogated would be put at the top level first, and then move down as they're being interrogated until finally they were barbecued to death at the lower level. This is the way the CIA's subsidiary service operated in its own country. Well, there are many, many more examples. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency was a creation of the CIA, and that was the instrument for keeping the military in power there all through these years. We did the same thing in Latin America. I worked with security intelligence services, which were merely an extension of our offices. I just ran them as if I was running, I was the chief of the service. We even gave them pencil and paper sometimes. They were so poor. And we would use them for anything we wanted, whether it was telephone tapping or letter intercepts, or to read people's mail, or for bugging operations, or for surveillance of people, or for having people being arrested. They worked simply at our beck and call. Well, I want to come back now for just a minute to JFK. And I want to ask a question: is it conceivable that some of the people who were doing these things around the world could have had the motivation and the capability to bring these methods home to kill the president? Stone asked me in Hamburg whether I thought, for example, it was feasible whether Allen Dulles, who had been fired by Kennedy after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion against Cuba, could have gotten together with Ed Lansdale, who had worked with the CIA in Vietnam and the Philippines in the 50s, whether he could have gotten Lansdale together with Lansdale and said, look, Kennedy is going to pull out of Vietnam. He's seeking better relations with Cuba. Talked to Bill Harvey, and Harvey was the CIA officer in charge of getting the mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro. Talk to Bill Harvey and see if he can come up with some way to get Kennedy. That's what Stone asked me. I said, Oliver, it's totally feasible. I don't know if it happened, of course. We don't know whether it happened, but I think it's totally feasible. Well, the debate goes on, over the film, whether Kennedy was going to leave, or how sure or how soon it was going to be, what exactly he had in mind as far as Cuba was concerned. But most recently, the participation of the mafia has come out from a lawyer who represented, or who served Jimmy Hoffa, who was the president of the Teamsters Union, and who himself disappeared after the Kennedy assassination. This lawyer, who is from Tampa, Florida, my hometown, his name is Frank Ragano. He has made public, just in the last couple of weeks, the fact that Hoffa told him in 1963 to go and see Santos Traficante, the leader of the South Florida Mafia who lived in Tampa, and Carlos Marcello in New Orleans, and ask them to organize an assassination of President Kennedy. So more is coming out, and of course, as I'm sure you're reading, this move to get the documentation released and declassified is going along very fast. And there is still another book out right now, which I am reading myself and have not finished, but it's Mark Lane's latest book. Mark Lane, wrote the first book, questioning or challenging the conclusion of the Warren Commission that Oswald had acted alone. It was called Rush to Judgment. Well, he's now brought out a new book called Plausible Denial, which is published by Thunder's Mouth, and in this book he shows all the reasons to believe that the CIA was the principal organization that organized the Kennedy assassination. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the other theories or beliefs as have come out in Jim Garrison's book. Jim Garrison, by the way, it's Jim Garrison's book I've always had on the table everywhere I go, but it happens that it's out of print right now. Another print is coming in probably this week to the publishers at Sheridan Square in New York. But Garrison, you know, those of you who saw the film, was crucified by the media in the 1960s. He was made to look a fool, an absolute fool, because he had the gall to challenge the Warren Commission. And that is, you know, being repeated today in the media with respect to the film, because the film is based, of course, on Garrison's book. Well, in the end, you know, Garrison got the last laugh because you saw him in there playing Earl Warren in the film, those of you who saw it. Well, some people have said that this Kennedy assassination was the first coup d'etat in the United States, in our history. But I would say it isn't. I believe it wasn't. I think it may be the second coup d'etat, but the first was the writing and the adoption of the Constitution. I say this because it was illegal for those 50-odd men gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 to write a new rule of government. They had been established under the Articles of Confederation as a subcommittee of the Congress to find solutions to problems in governing under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles specifically prohibited what they did. That is, write a whole new set of rules for government, a new constitution. Down on the table here, this purple book is a book I've been taking around for several years. I tell students and everybody everywhere that this could be the best $10 you could spend on a book during 4 or 5 years in college. It is where the Constitution comes from. It shows how it was written as an elitist governing document. It shows also how the Founding Fathers, or who they were, and how they were writing the Constitution in their own self-interest. That is, in the interest of the elite, the bankers, the lawyers, the merchants, the landowners, the slaveholders, and so forth. And in doing so, they wrote totally out of the political process 95% of the people of the country. Yet they still had the goal to begin the Constitution. You know, you've seen copies or photographs, those very, very big words at the beginning, "We the people of the United States," and they were like 5 or 6% of the people, as if none of the others counted, because they had written out of the Constitution all of the men without property, all of the indentured laborers, all of the Native Americans, they were considered savages, all of the African Americans, they were mostly slaves, and of course half the population, all the women. They wrote it in their own self-interest, and that comes across very well in the book. You can see there quite well, too, that there was great opposition to centralizing government in the United States and giving a federal government control over the lives of individuals, because before that, the state governments were the governing authority under the Articles of Confederation. And that changed the whole thing. It was a totally centralizing process, and one of the very first deceptions in the history of the United States was that the Federalists called themselves that, because they were not Federalists at all. They were the opposite. They were centralists, and they got their way. Well, Fraser points out very well in the book, the purple book there, how the opposition was broken down and how ratification of the various states was achieved through force, through chicanery, through trickery, and through violence. And that the only state that submitted the only state that submitted the Constitution to popular referendum, that was Rhode Island, that among the voters, the few who could vote there, they rejected the Constitution 13-1. Well, we're taught, you know, from the very first years that we are to revere this Constitution like the Bible or the Koran, the Talmud. In actual fact, it was a fraud from the very beginning. And there is another book, for those who are noting books, that is a terrific book on the origins of the Constitution and how it constituted a coup d'etat in the United States. It is called Liberating the Early American Dream. It is by a man named Alfred Anderson, and it's published at the Tom Paine Institute in Ukiah, California. Those of you who follow the grass trade or the hemp business will know the name Ukiah. It's in Mendocino County, where most of. Well, I mention this because there's still one more book I almost forgot, and that is a book that's just been published. I only saw the first notice on it a few days ago, and I haven't got it, but I'm going to get it this week. It is by Bertel Oldman and Jonathan Birnbaum. And I'll be down at the book table, by the way, when this is all over, so if you want me to repeat any of these names, I'll be glad to. But this is called The United States Constitution by Bertel Oldman, who is a professor there, and Jonathan Birnbaum, and it's published by New York University Press. I think this is probably going to be the definitive work, because Bertel has spent his whole life working on this matter. In any case, when I came back from the United States in 1987, after all those years abroad, without a visit, you remember what we were doing. 1987, remember what we were doing. We were celebrating the 200th anniversary of the Constitution. And as I watched all those celebrations going on, it was really an orgy of self-congratulation, I thought. It reminded me of a passage in Noam Chomsky's book, remarkable book called Turning the Tide. It was on Central America. Came out around 85, 86. But in that book, he discusses the Constitution also, and he discusses the convention in Philadelphia, where those 50-odd men got together in total secrecy. You know, not one word came out of what the debate was all about when they were debating what this Constitution would be. They didn't want anyone to know, and more than 50 years passed before the first information about what was said at the Constitutional Convention was made public. It was a totally secret process to which we are all still subjected today. Well, Chomsky relates in the book how the question arose at the Constitutional Convention, who really is to govern the United States? And John Jay had the answer. John Jay, you know, was the president of the Continental Congress, which fought the war for independence, and then he was the first Chief Justice of the United States. He said, well, of course, the people who own the United States ought to govern it. And that was the principle upon which they wrote the document, they wrote the Constitution, and that is still the rules of the game today. Even though there have been something like 25 amendments and there have been 200 years of legislation, it is still the rules of the game. Well, I'm going way over my time, and I'm simply going to wind up here quickly by mentioning something I don't want to leave out. And then we can get into the discussion, and I'll be very glad to go into matters of the CIA related with their penetration of academia with some examples, which I won't have a chance to do right now. But I want to mention that there is something that we can do about this question of governing. There is something that we can do about the CIA's activities abroad, because in the 1990s they are going to be doing the same things I described to you that they have been doing until now. Because though many people say the Cold War has ended, there has always been a North-South dimension to the Cold War, and that's where the fighting really took place, as in Vietnam. We all know that the East-West dimension, the military standoff between NATO and the United States and the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, that has disappeared. But from the very beginning, there has always been a North-South dimension to the Cold War. That is the war against the Third World. And every day, the dependency of the United States and the developed countries is greater on their dependency on the resources and the markets and the labor in the Third World. And that can only get greater. There won't be any change to that. And all the things that I was doing in Latin America and others, those were all for control in those countries, because the United States and its allies need those resources. And that, of course, is the reason for the Gulf War, a war that was totally unnecessary. I think, totally unnecessary. Saddam Hussein was made to believe that he could take over Kuwait with impunity, I think, by the Bush administration on purpose, so that the United States would have a new excuse to continue militarism in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But this type of activity, the support to death squads, as in El Salvador, where 75,000 people have been killed over 12 years, or in Guatemala, where nobody knows how many people have been killed in the 30, 40 years since the CIA, 35 years, I guess it is, since the CIA overthrew the democratically elected civilian government of that country, established death squads. Some people say in Guatemala maybe 125,000 people over the years. Some people say 150,000 people. Nobody really knows, because they've been literally disappeared. But all that bloodshed has been thanks to the CIA working in that country. I think these things are going to continue, so I think there is something that we all can do. We can do it in our daily lives. But the only place that the CIA can be confronted physically, practically the only place in this country, is on the campuses, because they have to come here physically to recruit. They, in 1988 at least, needed to hire about 1,000 new people each year, and most of those had to come from the universities. They have more doctorates, you know, more masters, more bachelor's degrees, specialized degrees of all sorts than any other U.S. government agency. They have to recruit, and they will tell you that they need to get people. And this is about the only place they can be confronted. Well, I have been working for some time now, several years, with a Chicago-based group called the CIA Off-Campus National Clearinghouse. And this group has published a book which is on the table called CIA Off-Campus. It was written by Amy Mills, who traveled with me all around in the fall when I was doing the lectures, and she was doing the workshops in conjunction with the lectures, and we'll be doing it again in April. Well, this group is available with organizers, with speakers, and so forth, and also my association is, can provide speakers at any time. We have a group of former CIA officers, former FBI officers, former Pentagon people like Dan Ellsberg. All of us are second thoughts people who did this work in the security services or intelligence services or military and have come to turn against what we did. Our association is called the Association of National Security Alumni. I wasn't here when the name was chosen. I live in Europe. I preferred actually the first name. The first name was, to me, much better, much more realistic on who we are. I don't know if I mentioned it when I was here at Carnegie Mellon before, but that first name, which we used when we were getting organized, was De Wimke. You know what that stands for? It's an acronym for something Helen Caldecott once called us: defectors from the white male killer establishment. Defectors from the white male killer establishment. Well, I strongly urge you to have a standing organization. Try to get something permanent going here and to monitor the activities of the agency when they're coming around to Pitt, to Carnegie Mellon, to any other schools in this area, and get together and help each other. And this group in Chicago is quite willing to provide the assistance necessary for that. And I'll be talking all about this tomorrow morning at the workshop. But there's another activity also, and that is to elect progressive candidates to office, and not just to the national government, but to local and state level. Very, very important. And this can be done with the National Organization of Women, it can be done with the Greens in certain states, but it's to get politically active. And finally, as a long-term goal, rewriting of the Constitution. To rewrite a Constitution which writes the most important human rights into the basic document, like the right to life, the right to education, the right to health care, the right to housing, the right to a job, to choices in the matter of procreation. All these are the most fundamental human rights which are in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights but are not in our own Constitution. These and other rights could alter also the current Constitution's most basic right, which is to unlimited accumulation and use of property and the power that goes with it. The result of this right today is that corporate profits prevail over the health of the physical environment as well as over the health of people under the delusion that economic growth has no limits. I recommend very strongly an essay by Gore Vidal on the Constitutional Convention from the nation that is holding a Constitutional Convention, because Article 5 of the Constitution provides that if two-thirds of the states request it, the Congress has got to convene a Constitutional Convention. And this was one of the things that Thomas Jefferson thought was so good about the Constitution. He thought that every generation, that is every 20 years or so, there should be a Constitutional Convention to change the form of government according to the new needs. Well, I want to recommend this essay by Gore Vidal in The Nation magazine of January 27th, in which he is writing about the Constitutional Convention. And he points out that, as others have, that this Article 5 provides that once two-thirds of the states have requested, then the Congress has to convene it. And then everything's up for grabs. The whole system can be rewritten. That is an illustration of the point of the importance of electing good people, progressive people, to local and state government. I mean, this is something that could take 10 years, it could take 20 years, but it is not a crackpot idea, and is not unrealistic, and it's certainly worth the trouble to be thinking about and keeping in mind, trying to get organized. Some may think it's impossible, but there's never been a constitutional convention ever. And think about the Soviet Union. Who would have believed just a couple of years ago that they could go through this whole decentralizing process with so little violence? Well, if they can restructure their whole society with so little violence, certainly when we look around us and see the tragedy facing us every single day, the calamities for so many people in this country, we can certainly be thinking about changing the Constitution here, I think. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that incremental improvements here or there are not worth it. They certainly are, and every reduction in this military budget is a positive thing. But my feeling is, of course, that the situation of tragedy that we see around us today is really a result of the Constitution itself. Well, 20 years ago, when I decided to write a book about the CIA, I didn't know what would happen, whether I could get it done, how I would survive trying. But I had a goal, and I thought I should try. For 5 years, as I said, I labored, happy to get in one more day of research, or happy to get 2 or 3 more pages written, all the while knowing that the CIA was right on top of me, or they were looking for me, or plotting who knows what. But I got that book done, and Bush's comments last fall, I think, are an unintended recognition that an idea and perseverance can prevail. And I'll leave you tonight with the words of Edward Abbey, whom many consider to be the patron saint of the ecology movement. Sentiment, he wrote, sentiment without action is the ruin of the soul. Thank you all very much for coming and for listening.